I never imagined that one moment could change the way I saw my family forever. One second, I was standing at the top of the staircase, arguing with my brother over something trivial, and the next, I was tumbling down the steps, my body slamming against each one with a force that stole my breath. My parents called it an accident, a careless slip, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. And when I finally saw the footage from the security camera hidden in our hallway, the truth I had feared was confirmed. It wasn't an accident at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Clara Mitchell, and growing up in a quiet suburban town in Ohio, I thought I knew my family. My parents, Sam and Linda Mitchell, always seemed loving and attentive on the surface. We lived in a modest two-story home with cream-colored walls and a small, neatly kept backyard. My younger brother, Ethan, was 3 years younger than me, a bright kid with a mischievous streak that often got him in trouble, but usually earned him a sly grin from our parents instead of punishment. I had always been a little more serious, a little more cautious, and perhaps a little too sensitive to the undercurrents in our household that others might overlook. It never occurred to me that the quiet tension I sometimes noticed between Ethan and I could escalate into something dangerous. It all began one spring afternoon when the sun was warm enough to slip out of school without a coat, and I had just returned home with my backpack slung over one shoulder. I dropped it in the hallway and headed upstairs to my room, only to find Ethan sprawled across the landing playing with one of his toy cars. "Move," I snapped, annoyed at the obstacle in my path. He looked up at me, eyes gleaming with a mix of defiance and something I couldn't quite place. "Not yet," he said stubbornly, spinning the car along the railing. "I'm not moving until Mom calls me for snacks." I felt a flare of irritation. I had been on my feet all day and had homework to finish, and here he was, deliberately blocking the staircase. "Ethan, get out of the way," I said, my voice a little sharper than I intended. That's when I noticed the expression on his face, a quick flash of anger that passed as fast as a storm cloud, but lingered long enough to make my stomach tighten. He stood up suddenly, and in a heartbeat, before I could react, he shoved me. It wasn't a playful shove, it was a calculated push, and I found myself tumbling down the steps, hitting each one with a sharp, bruising force. My head spun, pain radiating from my ankle and my shoulder, and when I finally landed at the bottom, gasping for air, Ethan was already running past me toward the kitchen. My parents came running immediately, Linda clutching her hands to her mouth while Sam knelt beside me, examining me for injuries. "Clara, are you okay? Did you fall?" he asked, voice tense but calm. "It's just an accident, sweetie," my mom said quickly, brushing off my cries and helping me to my feet. "We've all had slips before. You'll be fine." The words sounded comforting, but inside, something didn't sit right. The weight of Ethan's push pressed on me far heavier than any ordinary accident could. I tried to tell them, to explain that he had shoved me on purpose, but they didn't even give me the chance. Sam frowned but said, "Kids push each other sometimes. Don't make it a big deal." And Linda added, "Accidents happen. Go rest. You'll feel better soon." I wanted to argue, to insist, but fear and confusion tangled in my chest. I wasn't sure if my parents didn't believe me or if they just didn't want to believe it. Ethan, for his part, acted as if nothing had happened. He slipped out of the room, humming a tune, completely unbothered by the fact that I was writhing on the floor in pain. That small, casual disregard stung more than the fall itself. I hobbled to my room, my body sore and my mind racing. How could a shove be dismissed so easily? How could my parents see what happened and call it an accident? Something in the pit of my stomach told me that this wasn't over, that the truth had a way of demanding its own space no matter how tightly people tried to cover it up. Over the next few days, my injury slowly began to heal, but the unease inside me didn't fade. I started noticing small things. Ethan's sly smirks when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he avoided eye contact when our parents discussed minor incidents between us, and most disturbingly, the way Mom and Dad never questioned him, never asked why I had fallen. My school friends noticed the bruises and asked if I had slipped again, and I found myself giving the same rehearsed answer. Yeah, just an accident. But every time I said it, the words felt like a lie. It wasn't until a week later, when I was helping Dad set up a new Wi-Fi security camera in the hallway, that I realized there might be a way to know the truth. The camera was meant to monitor the front door, a precaution for package deliveries, but Dad agreed to point it down the hall as well, just to have a better view of the upstairs landing. That night, I lay awake in my room, listening to the house settle, heart pounding as I thought about the incident. Part of me wanted to erase the memory, to pretend Ethan's shove had never happened, but another part of me was determined. I had to know if my instincts were right, if my parents had been blind to the truth, or worse, if they had refused to see it. The next morning, I asked Dad if we could review the camera footage together. He hesitated, saying it was probably unnecessary, but eventually he agreed. As we scrolled through the video, my stomach dropped. There it was, clear as day, Ethan pushing me down the stairs, a deliberate, forceful shove, followed by his casual walk toward the kitchen, pretending nothing had happened. My hands trembled and my heart sank. The evidence was undeniable. For the first time, the uncertainty that had plagued me vanished. This wasn't an accident. My brother had done it on purpose, and my parents had been too quick to dismiss it. The feeling of betrayal was sharp, cutting deeper than any bruise. I realized then that my life at home would never feel the same, and that standing by silently was no longer an option. After seeing the footage, I thought the hardest part was over, but in reality, it was just beginning. I had discovered the undeniable truth, yet the world around me insisted on calling it something else. An accident, children being children, don't make a big deal out of it. My parents, Sam and Linda, continued their routines as if nothing had happened, and Ethan carried on with his life, his grin sharper and more knowing than before. Suddenly, the house that had once felt safe now seemed like a carefully constructed theater where everyone played their roles perfectly while hiding the real tension that simmered just beneath the surface. I started noticing patterns I had ignored for years. The way my complaints were minimized, the way Ethan's misbehavior was excused, and the subtle favoritism that always seemed to protect him even when he crossed lines that should have alarmed anyone with a conscience. School was no refuge either. I began withdrawing, unsure how to explain the situation without sounding paranoid. Friends noticed my sudden quietness and asked if I was okay, but I couldn't tell them that my own brother had tried to hurt me, that my parents had dismissed it, and that I was left alone to navigate the emotional aftermath. Even my teachers, who were otherwise kind and attentive, only saw the bruises and assumed clumsiness. "Kids get hurt all the time," one said with a sympathetic shrug when she noticed the fading marks on my arm and shin. I wanted to scream at her, to show her the footage, but I didn't even have the courage to confront my own parents yet. The truth felt heavy, a burden I carried silently, and every interaction seemed to highlight just how isolated I was. Home, of course, was the worst. Ethan's behavior became more calculating. He would leave his belongings strewn across a staircase, forcing me to navigate around them, sometimes slipping or tripping, and earning a small laugh from him if I stumbled. He began subtle verbal jabs as well, calling me clumsy, slow, or overly dramatic when I protested. Each comment was small on its own, but over time, they chipped away at my sense of security. I could see the thrill in his eyes, a dangerous mix of mischief and control that I had never fully appreciated before. It was as if he had learned the power of stealth and deception, and he was testing how far he could go before anyone noticed.
My parents' reactions, or lack thereof, made it worse. Linda insisted that Ethan was a sensitive boy who sometimes needed extra attention, while Sam focused on keeping the peace, emphasizing that no one should overreact to minor incidents. I realized that my parents weren't necessarily ignoring the truth, they were actively shaping the narrative, choosing to see things the way they wanted to, perhaps to avoid conflict, perhaps out of denial, or perhaps because they simply didn't want to believe that their youngest child was capable of such aggression. I started keeping a mental ledger, cataloging incidents that hinted at Ethan's dangerous tendencies. It wasn't just the shove down the stairs, it was the way he threw objects during arguments, the calculated timing of his small sabotages, and the subtle way he manipulated conversations to make me look unreasonable.
Even my extended family, when they visited, fell into the same patterns. My aunt would remark that siblings sometimes bickered, and my cousins laughed off similar experiences as harmless pranks. I wanted to scream that this was different, that the lines had been crossed, but I lacked proof beyond what I had already seen. The footage was hidden on a device that only I knew about, and the thought of exposing it prematurely felt dangerous. Ethan had already shown he could manipulate situations, charm adults, and feign innocence with unnerving ease. I had to be careful. I began to keep a private journal documenting each incident in detail, recording times, descriptions, and the reactions, or lack thereof, of my parents. Writing it down made the situation feel more real, as if I could finally acknowledge the truth without being silenced. I also noticed patterns in myself, moments of hesitation when passing the stairs, flinches when Ethan was nearby, a growing anxiety that colored everything from schoolwork to casual conversations. My friends started noticing my distracted demeanor, but I could only give vague explanations, afraid that sharing too much would make me seem unstable or exaggerating. Yet, each night, the fear gnawed at me, growing alongside the realization that if this continued unchecked, it could escalate. One particularly unsettling evening, I returned home to find the staircase blocked by a carefully arranged pile of boxes. Ethan sat at the top, pretending to be engrossed in a comic book. When I asked him to move, he looked up slowly, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and said, "Maybe you'll just have to climb over them, or fall again." The words sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate reminder of his power over me, the same power that my parents refused to acknowledge. I realized then that documenting the incidents wasn't enough. I needed someone outside our family to see what was happening, someone impartial who could recognize the pattern and take it seriously. I tried subtle tests, placing objects near the edge of the stairs to see if they would be moved or disturbed. I watched Ethan's reactions, noting how he lingered near me, watching my every movement with an intensity that bordered on predatory. Each day, the weight of the hidden problem became more unbearable. I could no longer ignore the fact that my home, the place that should have been a sanctuary, had become a minefield where one misstep could result in serious injury. The emotional toll was mounting, and I began experiencing sleepless nights, my mind replaying incidents over and over, searching for signs I had missed, wondering if I was imagining things or if the danger was real. By the end of the second week after the fall, I had compiled enough observations and notes to feel a fragile sense of clarity. The truth was undeniable. Ethan had pushed me intentionally, my parents had dismissed it, and the pattern of aggression was escalating. The question now was what to do next, how to confront the situation without putting myself in further harm, and how to finally make my parents see what I could no longer endure in silence. The hidden problem that had lurked beneath the surface of our family life was now impossible to ignore, and I understood that action was not only necessary, but urgent. The tension at home reached a breaking point one chilly Thursday evening, just as the sky outside was turning the muted shades of twilight. I had spent the afternoon attempting to finish an essay for school, but my focus was fractured, constantly distracted by the memory of Ethan's shove, the bruises that had yet to fully fade, and the sense of betrayal I felt from my parents' unwillingness to confront the truth.
I had been cataloging the latest incidents in my journal, noting subtle threats, overlooked provocations, and patterns in Ethan's behavior that were becoming increasingly manipulative. As I scribbled down my observations, I heard the familiar click of footsteps approaching the staircase. I glanced up to see Ethan, smirking, carrying a small stack of books in his hands. I braced myself, my chest tightening with a mix of anxiety and anger. "Watch it," I warned, my voice shaking slightly despite my attempt to sound firm. Ethan tilted his head, a slow, deliberate movement, and said, "Maybe you'll just have to climb over them, or fall again." His words sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate reminder of his power over me, the same power that my parents refused to acknowledge. I realized that stomping the turrets for help was the only way to intervene before something serious happened. I needed a way to confront Ethan and make them understand the danger I was in.
I marched toward the hallway, confronting Ethan directly. "This stops now," I said firmly, my voice stronger than I anticipated. "I'm done pretending this is okay. You pushed me down the stairs, and I know you'll do it again if I let it go." Ethan's grin faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of something like hesitation, though it quickly returned to his usual smug expression. "Oh, come on, Clara. You're overreacting. Mom and Dad said it was an accident." He leaned casually against the railing, arms crossed, as if daring me to escalate further. But this time, I refused to back down. I decided it was time to gather concrete evidence beyond what I had already seen. While I had the security footage from the week before, I needed more instances to prove that this wasn't a one-time event. I remembered the small Wi-Fi camera Dad had installed in the hallway, and I quietly adjusted it so that it recorded continuously while I was at school and while we were home in the evenings. I also started timing my movements, noting when Ethan was more likely to block the stairs, when he was prone to leaving objects in precarious positions, and when my parents were least likely to notice. Each day, I meticulously logged the data, my anxiety a constant companion, but the growing collection of evidence gave me a sense of control in a situation where I had felt powerless for so long. The inciting incident truly crystallized one evening when my parents were out for a rare dinner together, leaving Ethan and me alone at home. I was carrying a tray of snacks up the stairs to my room when, without warning, Ethan shoved me again. Not playfully, not carelessly, but deliberately. I stumbled violently, my elbow hitting the wall, and I almost fell entirely down the flight. Panic and adrenaline surged through me as I caught myself on the banister, heart pounding, knees weak. Ethan looked at me, eyes gleaming with mischief and malice, and said, "See? It's easy." At that moment, the truth became undeniable. He had learned that his actions had no consequences, that my parents' refusal to intervene had emboldened him. This wasn't sibling rivalry, it was intentional harm. After regaining my balance, I retreated to my room, shaking uncontrollably. I sat on my bed, clutching the security camera's remote, and realized that the only way to stop this was to confront it head on. I couldn't rely on my parents to see the truth. Their denial had become part of the problem. I needed an outside witness, someone impartial who could validate my experience, or the cycle would continue unchecked. The fear of escalating the situation warred with my determination to act. I knew that exposing Ethan would cause chaos, potentially ignite family conflict, and even lead to retaliation, but remaining silent was no longer an option. In the following days, I started testing my hypothesis further. I intentionally placed objects along the staircase and hallway, leaving them in spots where a shove could easily knock me down or trip me. I observed Ethan's reactions carefully, taking mental notes of how he lingered, smirked, or subtly moved items when he thought I wasn't looking. Each observation confirmed my suspicion. He wasn't clumsy, he wasn't careless, and he certainly wasn't innocent. His behavior had a pattern, an intentionality that could no longer be denied. Meanwhile, I noticed that my parents continued to deflect my attempts to discuss the incidents.
Whenever I brought up the falls or bruises, they insisted on minimizing them, brushing off my concerns with a tired, "kids are kids," or "don't exaggerate." The frustration, anger, and fear coalesced inside me, creating a sense of urgency that I could no longer ignore. By the end of the week, I realized that if I didn't take action immediately, something worse could happen. My brother's aggression was escalating, and my parents' inaction was enabling it. I decided to reach out to a close family friend, someone I trusted implicitly, who had always been perceptive and fair-minded. I carefully explained the situation, emphasizing the pattern of behavior and my concerns for my safety. They listened intently, asking probing questions that forced me to articulate the specifics I had been holding inside. Their response was immediate. They urged me to preserve the security footage and document every incident meticulously. They offered to intervene as a neutral party if necessary, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope that the truth could finally be recognized. That night, as I reviewed the camera footage once more, a mixture of fear and determination surged through me. I knew that the coming days would require courage, strategy, and patience. Ethan's shoves, smirks, and manipulations had exposed a hidden danger, one that had been quietly escalating in the shadows of our family life. I understood now that silence was no longer an option, that protecting myself and revealing the truth would require careful planning, and that the support of someone outside our immediate family could be the difference between continued harm and eventual justice. The inciting incident had shattered the illusion of normalcy, and I realized that my life and my sense of safety would never be the same until the truth was fully revealed. The first hint that the truth could no longer be ignored came the day I showed the footage to Mrs. Harlan, our family friend and neighbor who had always been like a second grandmother to me. She had raised 4 children of her own, and I trusted her instincts implicitly. After I nervously explained everything, she agreed to watch the footage. The moment she saw Ethan's deliberate shove, her expression shifted from gentle concern to unmistakable alarm. She paused the video, leaning closer to the screen, her eyes narrowing as she replayed the push over and over. "Clara, this isn't an accident," she said quietly, her voice firm but filled with care. "This is intentional, and your parents need to see this, or it's going to keep happening." Her words were like a spark, lighting a long-dormant flame of hope inside me. Someone finally acknowledged the danger, and for the first time, I felt a sense of validation that cut through the weeks of fear and frustration. Armed with Mrs. Harlan's support, I decided it was time to confront my parents with evidence they couldn't ignore. I carefully copied the footage to a separate drive and organized my notes, compiling a detailed timeline of incidents over the past month. I rehearsed my words in the mirror, trying to anticipate the excuses or denials they might offer. The following evening, I waited until Dad had returned from work and Mom had finished tidying the kitchen before asking to speak with them in the living room. Ethan had retreated to his room, presumably playing a game or texting friends, leaving the house eerily quiet except for the low hum of the heater. My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of dread and determination, as I prepared to finally bring the hidden truth into the open. "Mom, Dad," I began, my voice steady despite the trembling inside, "I need you to watch something." I handed Dad the drive, explaining that it contained the footage from the security camera. I didn't want to preface it with any assumptions, only to let the evidence speak for itself. Mom glanced at me skeptically, and Dad's eyebrows knitted together, but they agreed to watch. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken tension as we leaned into the screen. The first few frames were innocuous, Ethan walking down the hallway, Clara carrying books, but then it happened. The push. The deliberate shove that sent me tumbling down the stairs. My parents' reactions were immediate, yet complex. Dad's mouth opened, then closed, while Mom's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. He did this?" Mom whispered, her voice trembling as though the words themselves were foreign. I nodded, trying to keep my composure while my heart raced. "Yes, he pushed me, and it wasn't the first time," I said, explaining the other incidents I had documented, the times he had blocked the stairs intentionally, left objects in precarious positions, and mocked me when I protested. Dad leaned back into his chair, running a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to reconcile the son he knew with the actions captured on camera. "Clara, are you sure this is what it looks like?" he asked cautiously. I felt a mix of frustration and relief. Finally, he was paying attention. Finally, the truth was undeniable. Mrs. Harlan's presence had been crucial in this moment. I had invited her to sit in the living room under the pretense of a casual visit, and now she spoke up, her voice calm but authoritative. "Sam, Linda," she said, addressing my parents directly, "you've been seeing what you want to see instead of what's actually happening. Clara is not exaggerating. This is real, and if you don't take action, it will escalate." Her words cut through any lingering doubt, forcing my parents to confront the reality they had been avoiding. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of long-ignored tension, and I realized that the moment we were in was the true point of no return. The secret had been exposed, and the dynamic of our household was about to shift irrevocably. Dad finally spoke, his voice tight but resolute. "Ethan, come here," he called up the stairs. Ethan's door opened slowly, and he appeared, feigning innocence, as though he hadn't pushed me down the stairs, as though he had no idea why we were all staring at him. Mom gestured him to sit on the couch beside her, and the room fell into an uncomfortable quiet. I could feel my pulse racing as I anticipated the confrontation, my stomach twisting in anxiety and fear. Ethan's usual smug demeanor was replaced with something else. Hesitation, perhaps a flicker of awareness that his actions had consequences this time. I presented the timeline I had compiled, detailing each incident, explaining the context of the shove captured on video, and emphasizing the growing pattern of aggression that could no longer be ignored. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual confidence slipping as my parents watched, the evidence undeniable. Dad's voice was firmer now, tinged with authority, as he addressed Ethan. "This behavior is unacceptable. It stops now. You will explain yourself, and you will face consequences for your actions." Mom nodded, her hand gripping Dad's arm for support, and I felt a swell of relief and hope. For the first time, someone in the household other than me was acknowledging the truth, recognizing the danger, and preparing to take steps to prevent it from continuing. In that moment, I understood the significance of the first plot point. Outside eyes had seen the truth, and the dynamics of our family would never return to their previous state. The careful veil of denial that had protected Ethan and allowed the hidden aggression to flourish had been torn away. The confrontation, while just beginning, had shifted the power dynamic, and for the first time in weeks I felt a glimmer of control, a sense that the truth might finally bring protection and justice rather than fear and silence. The events of that evening marked a turning point, a decisive moment when the hidden reality of our household was forced into the light, and the path forward, though uncertain, was now paved with undeniable evidence and the support of someone who had seen and believed. The days following the confrontation felt surreal. For the first time, my parents were acknowledging the severity of the situation, yet the tension in the house didn't dissipate, it intensified. Ethan, once brazen and unapologetic, had grown cautious, calculating, his mischievous smirks replaced by quick glances and tight-lipped expressions. He sensed that the balance of power was shifting and that his previous tactics of intimidation and manipulation might no longer work. Meanwhile, I was consumed with a new determination to ensure the truth was fully recognized, not just by my parents, but by anyone who might intervene if things escalated further. I became meticulous in my documentation, capturing every interaction, every shove, every subtle provocation, knowing that the rising opposition required concrete proof to prevent any claims of exaggeration or misinterpretation. Ethan's response was subtle at first, but unmistakably deliberate. He began placing obstacles along my usual paths around the house, moving books, toys, and small furniture pieces into my way when he thought I wouldn't notice. The first time I tripped over one of his carefully placed items after the confrontation, I realized that his behavior wasn't spontaneous. It was strategy. He was testing the boundaries of what he could get away with now that his previous impunity had been interrupted. Each minor trip, each forced stumble was a challenge, a way for him to assert dominance and provoke a reaction. My anxiety spiked, but so did my resolve. I refused to let fear control me, so I countered by carefully noting every incident, marking time, location, and the presence or absence of parental observation. Even with the evidence I had, Ethan's cunning became increasingly apparent. He began manipulating perceptions, feigning innocence when my parents were present, carefully timing his minor acts of sabotage to occur when adults were preoccupied. He mastered the art of subtlety, a nudge of a backpack at the top of the stairs, a slight misalignment of a rug that could cause a slip, or whispered remarks designed to unsettle me emotionally. I quickly realized that the threat was no longer a single aggressive act, but a continuous campaign, testing both my composure and the limits of parental attention. Each incident increased my stress and anxiety, yet it also provided further proof that Ethan's aggression was intentional and escalating, a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The tension in the household was mirrored in the strained conversations with my parents. Sam tried to mediate, maintaining a sense of authority while also urging caution, but his words often sounded like they were aimed at protecting Ethan rather than addressing the behavior. Linda oscillated between disbelief and worry, occasionally giving Ethan gentle warnings that were more like suggestions than actual discipline. I could see the fear in their eyes, fear that the family dynamic would fracture, fear of acknowledging a hard truth about their son, and perhaps fear of the confrontation that might follow. Their inability to act decisively left me caught in the middle, forced to navigate the growing storm with both caution and courage. School became another layer of tension. While my friends had initially expressed concern, I found it difficult to confide in them about the ongoing situation at home. I feared that sharing too much would make me appear overly dramatic or that Ethan's manipulations could reach outside the household, further complicating my social life. Instead, I focused on my studies and extracurricular activities, using them as a distraction while mentally reviewing my growing body of evidence. I also began exploring options for outside intervention more seriously, researching local counselors and child advocacy resources, knowing that the next steps would require external support if the situation continued to escalate. Despite these preparations, there were moments that tested my patience and resolve. One evening, Ethan cornered me in the hallway, pretending to be playful, but his words carried a sharp edge. "You're really serious about this, huh?" he said, smirking, his tone half teasing, half threatening. I clenched my fists, heart racing, but I refused to retreat. "Yes," I said firmly, meeting his gaze. "This stops now." He tilted his head as if weighing my words, then backed off slightly, but I knew it was a temporary reprieve. The battle had shifted into a game of patience, observation, and strategic positioning, and both of us understood the stakes more clearly than ever before.
I doubled down on my evidence gathering, using the security camera to record not only the more obvious incidents, but also the subtler signs of intimidation. How Ethan would linger near the stairs, how he would arrange objects in ways that created potential hazards, and how he manipulated small household tensions to provoke emotional responses. Each recorded act strengthened my case, yet each day also heightened the psychological strain. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly alert, which took a toll on my sleep and concentration. But this careful documentation was essential. Without it, any confrontation risked being dismissed as overreaction or misinterpretation. By the end of the week, the accumulation of evidence had reached a tipping point. The pattern of behavior, the repeated and deliberate acts of aggression, and the parental inaction combined to create an undeniable narrative. This was not normal sibling conflict, nor was it occasional mischief. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of intimidation, and the opposition was clear. Ethan was resisting accountability, using both fear and deception to maintain control. The first pinch point was fully realized. The situation had escalated to a stage where the risk of confrontation, resistance, and retaliation was higher than ever, and the stakes were no longer abstract. The pressure to act, to speak, and to finally confront the growing danger was mounting, and I knew that the next steps would be critical in determining the outcome. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing on me. Every move, every word, every piece of evidence became part of a larger strategy. I had to stay vigilant, patient, and precise. The hidden truth had been exposed to some extent, but the real test, gathering enough evidence, confronting opposition, and ensuring that action would be taken, was just beginning. The rising tension and opposition had created a crucible in which courage, clarity, and strategy would determine the course of the battle for safety, justice, and recognition.
And I understood that if I faltered now, the consequences could be severe, not just emotionally, but physically as well. The major revelation came on a Friday evening, a night that began like any other, with the house quieting as the sun sank behind the suburban rooftops and the soft hum of the heater filling the spaces between rooms. I had been reviewing the security camera footage, replaying the incidents of the past 2 weeks to ensure my notes were accurate and nothing had been overlooked. Each clip was a small, undeniable piece of the pattern I had already begun to see. Ethan's deliberate shoves, his placement of obstacles, the subtle ways he forced me into vulnerable positions, but nothing had fully prepared me for what I was about to discover. I was scrolling through footage from the previous evening when my heart stopped, an icy tension gripping my chest. There it was. Ethan had not only shoved me down the stairs again, but he had done so in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. The camera captured every moment in vivid clarity. I could see Ethan standing at the top of the staircase, his body tense, his expression focused, almost predatory. I appeared in the frame moments later, carrying a small laundry basket. He waited until my back was turned, and then, with a force that was unmistakably intentional, he pushed me. I stumbled violently, my legs giving way, my arms flailing to catch myself, but there was no escaping the force. I hit the steps hard, the impact reverberating through my body, and I finally collapsed at the bottom, gasping for breath. Ethan glanced down at me, a faint, cruel smile crossing his face, before casually walking toward the kitchen as if nothing had happened. There was no accidental slip, no momentary misjudgment. This was deliberate, and the evidence was irrefutable. I replayed the footage multiple times, my hands trembling, my heart racing. The undeniable proof left me simultaneously shaken and empowered. I had always suspected, had always feared that my parents were blind to the reality of Ethan's actions, but now there was no ambiguity, no room for dismissal. The hidden truth, which had been clouded by parental denial and Ethan's cunning, was now fully exposed. I felt a strange combination of relief and dread. The relief of knowing the truth, the dread of what would come when it was finally confronted. And I also realized that this footage was the turning point. It was the kind of undeniable evidence that could no longer be ignored, the proof that would force action in confrontations that had been delayed for far too long. With the footage in hand, I approached Mrs. Harlan the next morning. Her keen eyes watched the replayed scene in silence, her hands folded in her lap, before she finally spoke. "Clara," she said quietly, her voice low but resolute, "this isn't just aggression anymore. This is intentional harm, and now you have the proof. This changes everything." I nodded, swallowing hard, knowing that she was right. This footage, combined with my detailed documentation, created an objective record that could no longer be brushed aside. It was concrete, undeniable, and actionable. The revelation was transformative. It shifted the balance from suspicion to certainty, from fear to a cautious but determined sense of empowerment.
The revelation also crystallized the path forward. I realized that confronting my parents and Ethan directly, armed with this undeniable proof, was no longer optional. It was necessary. The incident had escalated beyond mere sibling rivalry, beyond minor conflicts and misunderstandings. Ethan's behavior was calculated, manipulative, and increasingly dangerous. Remaining silent, pretending the situation could be managed without intervention, was no longer safe. The stakes had risen, and the clarity brought by the footage made the next steps urgent. I knew that inaction could lead to further harm, both physically and emotionally, and that it was my responsibility to ensure accountability. Later that evening, I carefully set up a meeting with my parents, insisting that Mrs. Harlan be present as a witness. The tension in the living room was palpable, a heavy silence hanging in the air as Dad sat with his hands folded, Mom clasping her fingers tightly in her lap, and Ethan, suspicious of the unusual gathering, peered around the corner of his room with cautious curiosity. I connected the drive to the television, my pulse pounding as I prepared to press play. The moment the footage appeared on the screen, the atmosphere shifted. My parents' expressions transformed from initial apprehension to shock, disbelief, and finally recognition. The repeated push, the deliberate intention, and the casual dismissal afterward left no room for denial. For the first time, I saw a mix of horror and accountability in their eyes, an acknowledgement that the truth could no longer be ignored. Ethan, realizing that the evidence could not be disputed, froze. His usual bravado faltered, replaced by a mixture of anger, fear, and frustration. The denial he had relied upon for weeks dissolved in the face of objective proof. I watched him shift uncomfortably, the weight of his actions pressing down on him in a way it never had before. The undeniable proof was more than just a video. It was a catalyst, forcing recognition, confrontation, and the inevitable reckoning with behavior that could no longer be excused. In that moment, I felt a surge of both triumph and apprehension. The major revelation had not only exposed Ethan's actions, but had also begun to dismantle the patterns of denial and avoidance that had allowed them to continue. The turning point was complete. The evidence was undeniable, the stakes were real, and the next phase of confrontation and resolution was unavoidable. I knew that my courage, my persistence, and my careful documentation had brought us to this point, and that the challenges ahead, while daunting, could now be faced with clarity, support, and the irrefutable truth finally on my side. The moment I realized I had to speak up fully hit me the following morning, and it came with a heavy weight that made my chest ache and my stomach twist. Seeing the undeniable proof of Ethan's aggression had been one thing, but knowing that action was necessary, that I could no longer remain silent or let my parents dismiss what was happening, was another entirely. The footage had stripped away any illusions, leaving a raw clarity. If I didn't act now, the situation would escalate further, and I could not bear the thought of another shove, another fall, or worse consequences. I felt the enormity of the decision pressing down on me. It wasn't just about telling my parents the truth anymore. It was about ensuring safety, accountability, and the recognition that my voice mattered, even in a household where it had often been ignored. I gathered my courage and sat down at the kitchen table, inviting Mom and Dad to join me. Ethan, sensing that something serious was about to happen, lingered in his room, pretending to read a book but casting occasional glances down the hallway. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the tension-filled room, every second stretching longer than the last. I knew this confrontation would force the truth into the open, and that it would test every bond and loyalty within our family. "I need to say something," I began, my voice trembling slightly, though I pushed through it. "I can't keep pretending everything is okay. Ethan pushed me down the stairs, more than once, and it wasn't an accident. I have the footage, and it's clear what happened." My parents exchanged a quick glance, a mixture of fear, concern, and the weight of realization settling over them. Mom's hand flew to her mouth, while Dad leaned back, gripping the edge of the table as if bracing himself. I pressed on, explaining every detail I had meticulously documented, the incidents, the subtle manipulations, the obstacles Ethan had placed, and the ways his behavior had escalated despite their previous reassurances. I've been keeping track, watching carefully, and I can't stay silent anymore. This has to stop. I need you to see it for what it is. For the first time, I felt the full intensity of my own resolve, a courage born not from recklessness, but from necessity. Silence had allowed danger to persist, and I refused to let it continue.
Ethan finally emerged from his room, drawn by the serious tone of the conversation. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, attempting his usual air of nonchalance, but his eyes betrayed unease. "You're really going to make a big deal out of this?" he asked, a hint of mockery in his voice. I met his gaze directly, refusing to back down. "Yes," I said firmly. "I've been patient. I've tried to handle this quietly, but this ends now. You can't keep doing this, and I won't stay silent while it continues." My words were deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of weeks of fear, observation, and evidence gathering. For the first time, the roles were reversed. I was no longer the passive recipient of his aggression. I was asserting control over the narrative, forcing recognition of the truth. The room fell silent, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Ethan's usual smirk faltered as he realized that the safety net of parental denial was no longer reliable. He had counted on being able to charm, manipulate, and feign innocence, but the combination of undeniable evidence, Mrs. Harlan's support, and my own assertive presentation of facts had stripped away that illusion. I could see a flash of fear in his eyes, a flicker of awareness that his actions would finally have consequences. Meanwhile, my parents' expressions shifted from shock to determination. Dad's voice, firm and steady, broke the silence. "Ethan, you need to explain yourself. This behavior stops immediately. There will be consequences for what you've done." Mom nodded, her hand resting on Dad's arm for support, her voice steady but firm. "Clara is telling the truth. We will not ignore this." Despite their acknowledgement, I knew the moment was still precarious. Ethan's reaction was a mixture of defiance and uncertainty, his posture rigid as if weighing how far he could push back. He attempted to argue, to minimize, to deflect blame, but the evidence, the footage, the meticulous records, the witness in Mrs. Harlan was undeniable. I could see the frustration building in him, a realization that the shield of parental disbelief had been stripped away. Every feint, every small act of manipulation he had relied upon now held no power. I felt a surge of vindication, tempered by the knowledge that this confrontation was only the beginning, that the coming days would require constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and unwavering courage. The decision to speak up had shifted the dynamics of our household irrevocably. My voice had been heard, and my perspective validated, but the consequences were immediate. Ethan's resistance intensified. Small acts of defiance, sulking, and passive-aggressive behavior emerged as he tested the boundaries of the new reality. Meanwhile, my parents struggled to navigate their new awareness, attempting to balance fairness, discipline, and the shock of recognizing that the child they had dismissed as mischievous had acted with deliberate aggression. I became acutely aware of the delicate balance we now had to maintain, enforcing accountability without escalating conflict, monitoring behavior without losing trust, and ensuring that the truth remained central to every decision. That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on the significance of the moment. Speaking up had been terrifying, but it had also been liberating. The choice to no longer protect others by silence, to fully confront the reality of Ethan's actions, had shifted the trajectory of our household. I understood that this was the true point of no return. The hidden truth was now fully exposed, and the coming days would test courage, loyalty, and integrity in ways I could only anticipate. I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that the confrontation had begun, but that the path to full accountability, safety, and justice would require persistence, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The mounting pressure became palpable almost immediately after the confrontation. Ethan, no longer able to rely on parental denial or ignorance, began escalating his tactics in subtle but unmistakably deliberate ways. His aggression transformed from physical shoves to psychological games, a steady drip of intimidation and manipulation that tested both my patience and my parents' resolve. Each day the tension thickened, saturating every corner of the house, turning once familiar spaces into minefields of anxiety and caution. I found myself double-checking every step on the stairs, every corner of the hallway, hyper-aware of what he might be plotting next. The very air in the house seemed charged with anticipation, the calm before a storm, and I understood that this was the moment when the hidden truth collided head-on with the full force of opposition.
Ethan's tactics were methodical. He began placing objects strategically, testing my reactions, watching closely as I navigated the house. He left books and shoes in tight spaces, shifted rugs in ways that could make me stumble, and occasionally blocked doorways or passages, forcing me to confront him directly. Each act, while small on its own, was part of a larger pattern, an orchestrated attempt to unsettle me and regain a sense of control. He also upped his verbal manipulation, making offhand remarks about my
overreacting or being too sensitive, all delivered with a casual smile that seemed designed to undermine my confidence. I could feel the pressure building, not only from the physical reminders of his aggression, but also from the emotional strain of knowing that each move was intentional and calculated.
The psychological weight was compounded by the parental dynamic. While my parents were fully aware of the truth, their struggle to enforce consequences consistently created a tense push and pull within the household. Dad tried to maintain authority, issuing clear directives and consequences, but his efforts were occasionally undermined by Mom's instinct to protect both children, leading to subtle inconsistencies that Ethan exploited. He would feign innocence or appeal to their sympathy, testing the limits of parental patience. I could see the strain in their faces, the way they shifted uncomfortably when making decisions, and the way their love for both children made it difficult to take decisive action without fear of alienating one or the other. The household had become a battleground, each interaction a microcosm of larger stakes, where careful strategy and vigilance were essential. School provided no respite. My focus was fragmented, the mental load of constantly monitoring Ethan's behavior at home weighing heavily on me. Small incidents at school, misplaced homework, minor conflicts with classmates, or brief misunderstandings with teachers triggered amplified stress, making the days feel longer and the nights shorter. Sleep was increasingly elusive, my mind replaying every incident, analyzing interactions, and preparing for the next escalation. Yet through the pressure, a sense of clarity emerged. I knew that vigilance, careful documentation, and strategic thinking were my allies, and that patience, though difficult, was essential to navigating this period of confrontation. One evening, the tension reached a new peak. Ethan had been unusually quiet, a silence that immediately set off alarms in my mind. As I carried laundry up the stairs, I noticed him lurking near the landing, his posture rigid, a faint glint of anticipation in his eyes. My heart pounded, but I refused to show fear. "Stop," I said firmly, meeting his gaze. "This ends now. I'm done playing games." He tilted his head, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, but the calculated confidence that had characterized him before the confrontation was gone, replaced by a tense curiosity, an assessment of what my next move might be. This moment underscored the stakes. Ethan's challenge was no longer physical alone, it had become a psychological battle, a struggle for control over the household narrative and the perception of power. Parental intervention was crucial in this escalation. Dad stepped in decisively, reminding Ethan that his actions were unacceptable and that consequences would follow, while Mom reinforced the seriousness of the situation, emphasizing safety and accountability. Their combined authority began to pressure Ethan, but his resistance remained strong, manifesting in passive-aggressive comments, calculated silences, and subtle acts of defiance that tested every boundary. I observed closely, noting every reaction, every adjustment in his behavior, understanding that the stakes of this confrontation extended beyond a single incident. The opposition had mounted fully, and the confrontation was no longer just about one shove, it was about power, control, and recognition of the truth. The security camera became an indispensable tool in this period. Each night I reviewed footage, cataloging subtle behaviors, documenting the sequence and timing of his actions, and noting patterns that demonstrated intent. The subjective evidence became my anchor, a constant reminder that the truth was on my side, even when the psychological pressure threatened to overwhelm me. The footage also served as a tangible validation to my parents, reinforcing the need for consistent intervention and providing clarity when disputes arose over perceptions of incidents. The camera turned the invisible opposition into visible proof, creating a framework for accountability that had previously been impossible to enforce.
By the end of the week, it was clear that the confrontation had reached its peak. Ethan's calculated resistance, the mounting psychological pressure, and the household tension had transformed our home into a crucible where truth, courage, and resilience were being tested simultaneously. I understood that this was the second pinch point. The stakes had never been higher, the opposition was fully aware of the threat posed by the revealed truth, and the coming days would require both careful strategy and unwavering courage. Every act, every word, and every decision carried consequences, And I knew that the resolution of this period of confrontation would determine the trajectory of both our immediate safety and the long-term recognition of the hidden truth. One evening, the tipping point came when Ethan followed me into the kitchen, his expression a mix of frustration and defiance. "You think you've won, huh?" he said, voice low and mocking. I froze for a moment, my chest tightening as the familiar rush of fear surged through me. I had hoped that parental authority, combined with the undeniable evidence of his actions, would curb his aggression. But it was clear that he was testing boundaries in ways designed to provoke a reaction. My hands trembled slightly as I tried to remain calm, but inside, the pressure was building. Every instinct screamed for caution. Every memory of past shoves reminded me of the potential physical danger. And yet, I refused to back down. I realized that standing my ground in the face of escalating opposition would take every ounce of courage I had. The fallout extended beyond the immediate household. At school, I became more withdrawn, constantly replaying the events at home and the escalating psychological pressure. Sleep was elusive. I would lie awake at night, imagining the worst-case scenarios, fearing that Ethan's behavior would spiral further or that my parents' patience might falter. The emotional toll was immense. Anxiety, fear, and self-doubt intertwined, leaving me exhausted and questioning whether speaking up had been worth it. The very act of exposing the truth had brought validation and support, but it had also drawn a storm of consequences that I had only just begun to comprehend. I felt isolated, as though the weight of responsibility rested entirely on my shoulders, and the familiar comforts of home had transformed into spaces of uncertainty and tension. My parents, though supportive, were also under immense pressure. Dad tried to enforce rules consistently, but even his firmness was met with subtle resistance from Ethan, who seemed to enjoy the challenge of pushing boundaries while staying just within the limits of acceptable behavior. Mom struggled to mediate, torn between empathy for both children and the knowledge that one of them had caused deliberate harm. The strain on them translated into the household atmosphere, amplifying the emotional tension I already carried. Every interaction became a careful negotiation, a test of boundaries and patience, leaving little room for spontaneity or relaxation. The psychological toll of constant vigilance was palpable. Even casual movements, small comments, or incidental accidents became sources of stress and potential escalation. The security camera remained my anchor during this period. Nightly reviews became both a necessity and a burden, forcing me to confront every subtle act of defiance, every calculated risk Ethan took, and every instance where my safety was compromised. Watching the footage, I sometimes felt a mixture of validation and despair. The undeniable evidence reinforced the reality of the situation, but the accumulation of incidents made the scope of the problem painfully clear. The house, once a place of relative comfort, now felt like a battleground, every corner fraught with potential danger, every interaction weighted with consequence. The footage also highlighted the psychological toll. I could see the fear in my own movements, the tension in my posture, the way my reactions had become measured and cautious in response to constant threat. One particularly intense night, I found myself cornered in the hallway by Ethan. He had subtly moved a chair into the landing, a trap for my foot, and blocked my retreat with his body. My heart raced, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the full force of vulnerability, the raw terror that had haunted me from the moment the first shove had occurred. I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins, my hands trembling slightly, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. In that moment, I understood the full magnitude of the consequences of speaking the truth: fear, retaliation, isolation, and the emotional weight of confronting a household divided by denial, aggression, and conflicting loyalties. Yet, even as the fear threatened to overwhelm me, I refused to give in. I held my ground, breathing deeply,
reminding myself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to face it despite the stakes. The lowest point extended beyond physical confrontations. Emotional manipulation became a constant undercurrent. Dismissive comments from Ethan, subtle challenges to my credibility, and the occasional moments of parental hesitation amplified the sense of uncertainty and self-doubt. I began questioning whether speaking the truth had made things worse, whether the temporary relief of validation could outweigh the constant strain of heightened tension. I felt the weight of isolation keenly. Friends at school couldn't fully understand, my parents were stretched thin, and Ethan's persistent defiance made even simple interactions nerve-wracking. The emotional and physical toll had reached a peak, a true dark night of the soul, where the cost of truth seemed almost unbearable. Yet, within the darkness, a fragile determination remained. I reminded myself why I had acted, why I had collected evidence, and why I had finally spoken up. The revelation, the confrontation, and the documentation were not just acts of defiance. They were acts of survival, of courage, and of justice. Even in the face of mounting retaliation, the truth was on my side, and that realization, though faint, provided a glimmer of hope. I understood that the lowest point was not the end, but a crucible, a test of resilience that would ultimately shape the path towards resolution and vindication.
The final push began on a Saturday morning, a day that had been deliberately set aside for a full family meeting, an official confrontation with the truth laid bare, and a determination to hold everyone accountable. The air in the house was thick with tension as we gathered in the living room. Dad took a seat at the head of the sofa, Mom beside him, and I positioned myself in front of the television where the security footage would be displayed. Ethan, wary but defiant, remained near the doorway, arms crossed, pretending to be disinterested, but the tension in his posture betrayed his anticipation. The stakes were high. This was no longer a private matter. It was a moment where actions would be judged and the truth would finally be undeniable. I felt my heart pounding, not from fear alone, but from the knowledge that this was the moment everything would either shift or remain trapped in denial. I began by summarizing the incidents I had documented, careful to speak clearly and confidently, relying on the facts rather than emotion alone. Ethan has pushed me multiple times, I said, gesturing toward the television. It wasn't an accident. The camera recorded it, and the pattern is deliberate. Dad nodded, his jaw tight, while Mom clasped her hands in front of her, both parents fully focused on the unfolding evidence. I could see Ethan shifting uncomfortably, his usual bravado fading as he realized that the combination of facts, documentation, and parental attention left no room for manipulation. "We need to look at this together," I continued, playing play on the footage. The familiar images appeared, Ethan's calculated shove clear and unmistakable, followed by my stumble down the stairs. The clarity of the visual proof left no room for interpretation. Every action deliberate, every intent unmistakable. As the footage played, Dad's expression hardened. "Ethan," he said firmly, voice low but authoritative, "this is unacceptable. You have been given chances to act responsibly, and this behavior is dangerous. You must explain yourself and accept the consequences." Mom added her voice, calm but resolute. "Clara has been honest and brave in showing us the truth. We cannot ignore this anymore. Safety, accountability, and respect must guide your actions from now on." I watched Ethan's face as the weight of the evidence pressed down on him. His smirk was gone, replaced with a mix of anger, fear, and the dawning realization that his actions had consequences beyond his control. The confrontation had stripped away his manipulations, leaving the stark reality of his behavior exposed to those whose judgment mattered most. Ethan tried to speak, initially with a defensive tone, then with feigned innocence. "It was just a shove," he muttered, attempting to minimize the situation. But the combined force of the visual proof, my meticulous documentation, and parental authority left no room for doubt. Each act, each shove, and each subtle manipulation had been recorded, cataloged, and presented clearly.
I could see the internal conflict in his eyes, the first stirrings of accountability, however reluctant. Dad's voice cut through the tension, unwavering. It doesn't matter how you describe it. The fact is, your actions caused harm and they were deliberate. There will be consequences, and they start now. Mom agreed, reinforcing that this was a unified parental stance, not a negotiation. The confrontation extended beyond the immediate evidence. We discussed patterns of behavior that had previously been dismissed, subtle provocations and incidents where Ethan had tested boundaries, manipulated circumstances, and challenged authority. Each piece reinforced the central truth. This was not a single lapse in judgment, but a sustained pattern of intentional aggression. Ethan's defensiveness grew as he realized that his attempts to redirect blame or feign innocence were futile. I felt a surge of vindication, but also a sense of responsibility. This confrontation was not just about exposing him, it was about ensuring change, accountability, and safety moving forward. The climax of the confrontation came when we collectively decided on actionable consequences. Dad outlined clear rules. Ethan would have restricted access to certain areas when unsupervised, would participate in household responsibilities with oversight, and would attend family counseling sessions to address the underlying causes of his aggression. Mom emphasized communication, accountability, and the importance of respecting boundaries. Ethan, reluctantly, accepted these directives, the weight of undeniable evidence and parental authority compelling compliance. I could see a flicker of resistance, but it was tempered by the reality that further aggression would result in stricter consequences. The final push had shifted the household dynamic decisively. The truth had been confronted, accountability established, and a framework for future safety implemented. I felt a profound sense of relief, tempered by awareness. This was not a resolution alone, but a turning point, the point at which truth, courage, and accountability intersected to create a path forward.
Sitting back after the confrontation, I reflected on the significance of the moment. The final push had not only exposed the truth to my parents and Ethan, but it had also validated my courage and persistence. The hidden aggression that had plagued the household could no longer be ignored, denied, or manipulated. The confrontation had forced recognition, established consequences, and initiated a process of change. I realized that this was the culmination of weeks of preparation, documentation, and bravery. The moment where the truth was finally presented, acknowledged, and acted upon. The house, once fraught with tension and fear, now carried a cautious sense of equilibrium, the first steps toward lasting safety and accountability finally underway. The days and weeks following the confrontation were a period of careful adjustment, a time when the household began to breathe again under the new equilibrium established by accountability and truth. Ethan, now fully aware that his actions had consequences and that attempts to manipulate or intimidate would no longer succeed, started to navigate the space between rebellion and compliance. It was not an instant transformation, old habits die hard, but the structure imposed by Dad, Mom, and the undeniable evidence provided a framework for behavioral change. For the first time in months, I could move through the house without that constant undercurrent of fear, the tension easing gradually, like a taut rope finally slackening. It was a relief unlike anything I had experienced, and it allowed me to see the subtle but significant shifts in the family dynamic. Mom and Dad became more engaged, actively reinforcing rules and boundaries, while also acknowledging the courage it had taken for me to speak up. Their support was consistent and unwavering, a marked change from the earlier oscillation between doubt and concern. Each small victory, Ethan following directives, refraining from instigating conflict, or showing respect for personal boundaries, was recognized and affirmed. Mom would often pause in the evening, reflecting aloud about how much clarity had come from the confrontation and how proud she was that I had stood firm. Dad, typically reserved in his praise, found ways to underscore accountability as a shared responsibility while emphasizing the importance of safety, honesty, and integrity. This consistent reinforcement slowly rebuilt trust in the family structure and reminded all of us that change was possible when truth was acknowledged and acted upon.
The new confrontation had forced Ethan to recognize that manipulation would no longer find fertile ground, that parents would now actively and consistently follow through with consequences, and that my courage had shifted the balance of power. He would occasionally test boundaries, pushing in minor ways to gauge reactions, but each attempt was met with a clear, measured response from both parents and, at times, myself. The difference now was profound. The opposition that had once been unchecked and escalating was now contained and addressed immediately. I could see the tension in his movements soften, the guarded suspicion in his eyes transform into moments of cautious acknowledgement. Slowly, he began participating in discussions, offering small apologies, and even taking initiative in household responsibilities, a tentative but meaningful shift toward accountability. The transformation was not dramatic or instant, but the direction was unmistakable, and it demonstrated that truth and consequence, when consistently applied, could alter long-established patterns of behavior. I also noticed the personal changes in myself during this period. The weeks of observation, documentation, confrontation, and defense of my truth had tested my patience, resilience, and courage in ways I had not imagined possible. I had learned to navigate fear, assert boundaries, and maintain composure under pressure. There was a newfound confidence in my voice, a certainty that my perspective and my experiences mattered. The empowerment I felt was quiet, but profound, an internal shift that reinforced my ability to face adversity while maintaining integrity. The emotional toll of the past months had been immense, but it had forged a resilience that was now woven into the very way I moved through daily life. I carried myself differently, aware of my agency and the responsibilities that come with standing up for what is right. The household itself began to settle into a more stable rhythm. Family dinners became moments of engagement rather than battlegrounds. Conversations were more deliberate, and small acts of cooperation became a norm rather than the exception. Ethan, while still learning, participated in shared chores and respected boundaries in ways that had previously seemed impossible. Mom and Dad reinforced consistency, ensuring that every act of defiance or aggression was met with immediate and proportional response, strengthening the household's sense of fairness and accountability. The environment was far from perfect, but it was no longer a place where fear dictated movement and speech. It had become a space in which the hidden truth had transformed the rules, the relationships, and the shared understanding of safety. There were moments of reflection, too. I realized that the struggle had been more than just about physical shoves down the stairs. It had been about establishing a culture of truth, integrity, and mutual respect. The confrontation had forced us all to confront long-standing patterns, test loyalties, and reassess the importance of honesty and accountability. It had also highlighted the role of courage in enacting change, showing that even in environments where denial and manipulation dominate, steadfast adherence to truth could shift power dynamics and transform relationships.
By the end of the month, the equilibrium was evident not only in behavior but also in atmosphere. The house felt calmer, safer, and more predictable, with clear boundaries and expectations that were consistently reinforced. Ethan, while still a work in progress, had begun to internalize lessons about accountability and respect. I felt validated, empowered, and hopeful, recognizing that the courage I had exercised had not only protected me, but had also initiated a meaningful shift in the household dynamic. The resolution was not a sudden miracle, but a gradual process, a testament to the power of truth, persistence, and carefully applied consequences in restoring balance and fairness to a previously volatile environment. The transformation was not sudden, but by the time several weeks had passed, the sense of fear and tension that had once defined our household had been replaced with a quiet stability and a renewed sense of purpose for me. The events of the past months, documenting Ethan's actions, confronting the undeniable evidence, and asserting my voice despite fear, had reshaped not only the family dynamic, but also my understanding of my own resilience and power. I walked through the house differently now, lighter, aware that the space I inhabited was no longer dominated by uncertainty or intimidation. I had learned that courage was a muscle that grew stronger when exercised, and the process of standing up for myself had instilled in me a sense of confidence that extended far beyond the walls of our home. Ethan, though still learning the boundaries of acceptable behavior, had begun to demonstrate signs of genuine change. He participated more actively in family responsibilities, sought to repair some of the relational damage caused by his previous aggression, and gradually internalized lessons about accountability. While his transformation was not complete, the consistency of consequences and parental guidance had laid the foundation for sustainable growth. I could see subtle shifts in his behavior, less manipulation, fewer provocations, and a tentative willingness to communicate more openly rather than resorting to fear or control. These changes, as small as they were, reinforced the notion that the truth, when confronted, had the power to alter behavior and restore equilibrium. My parents, too, had evolved. The initial shock and guilt over their previous dismissal of the incidents had given way to a newfound commitment to vigilance, fairness, and consistency. Mom became more deliberate in her reinforcement of boundaries, balancing empathy with accountability, while Dad solidified his role as the enforcer of consequences and the guardian of household safety. Together, they created a framework that no longer relied on assumption, denial, or hope that issues would resolve themselves. Their actions demonstrated that acknowledgement of truth and deliberate, measured intervention could prevent further harm and cultivate an environment where all members were respected and protected. The family, once fractured by deception and inaction, was slowly learning to operate on a foundation of honesty, safety, and shared responsibility. For me, the most profound transformation was internal. I had discovered the strength in asserting my perspective, the importance of collecting evidence, and the necessity of confronting uncomfortable truths even when the opposition was close and personal. I realized that empowerment was not simply about being fearless. It was about acting with clarity, strategy, and moral conviction in the face of fear. The courage I had exercised in documenting, confronting, and defending the truth had reshaped my sense of self, instilling a confidence that extended far beyond the walls of our home. The security camera, which had once been a tool of necessity and surveillance, now served as a reminder of the power of objective truth. The footage that had exposed Ethan's deliberate aggression was no longer just evidence, it was a symbol of accountability, a record that had catalyzed meaningful change, and a testament to the importance of documentation when confronting deception. I often reflected on the nights spent reviewing the videos, the meticulous notes I had kept, and the moments of fear and doubt that had accompanied each step of the process. The work had been exhausting, emotionally taxing, and at times terrifying, but the transformation that it enabled within the household and within myself made every moment of struggle worthwhile. I also found a new sense of purpose in the experience. Recognizing the hidden truths in my own household inspired me to become more aware of the struggles others might face in silence. I began sharing my experience cautiously, offering guidance and support to friends who found themselves in situations where aggression, manipulation, or denial threatened their safety or peace of mind. I understood that the courage to speak up and insist on accountability was not just a personal victory, it was a message to others that silence was not the only option, and that taking action, even when difficult, could transform situations and protect those at risk. The household continued to evolve. Family dinners became more than routine. They became opportunities for communication, reflection, and mutual understanding. Ethan's small gestures of compliance and cooperation were acknowledged and reinforced, while I, too, was encouraged to express my thoughts and feelings openly. The environment, once dominated by fear and tension, now carried the sense of stability that comes from consistent accountability and mutual respect. We were not perfect, but there were still challenges to navigate, but the foundation of honesty, courage, and integrity had been established.
Looking back, I realized that the hidden truth, what had once seemed dangerous to reveal, what had been dismissed, denied, and manipulated, had ultimately become the catalyst for transformation. By standing firm, presenting evidence, and insisting on accountability, I had changed not only the immediate circumstances, but also the trajectory of my household and my own life. The courage to act had rippled outward, creating safety, respect, and understanding where there had once been fear and tension. I felt a sense of closure, of empowerment, and of hope that extended far beyond the events themselves. A reassurance that truth, when pursued relentlessly and strategically, had the power to heal, restore, and inspire. As I closed my bedroom door that evening, I took a moment to reflect on the journey. The fear, the retaliation, and the isolation had been intense, but they had been necessary crucibles in which resilience, courage, and integrity had been forged. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of peace, and a readiness to face the future with confidence, knowing that the lessons learned and the boundaries established would continue to guide me. The transformation was complete. Not only had the household shifted towards safety and accountability, but I had emerged empowered, capable, and ready to use my experience to help others. A living testament to the power of truth, courage, and unwavering determination. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.